The decolonization movements represented history's most rapid and extensive transfer of political power from colonial empires to independent nations. Between 1945 and 1975, over 90 colonies achieved independence from European, American, and Asian imperial powers. Approximately 800 million people gained sovereignty and self-determination. The colonial world that dominated global affairs since 1500 collapsed within a single generation. Decolonization fundamentally reshaped international relations, creating modern nation-state system predominating contemporary world order. European colonialism had dominated global affairs for 450 years before decolonization began. European powers controlled Africa, Asia, Americas, and Pacific territories by 1945. Britain controlled India, vast African territories, Caribbean islands, and Pacific colonies. France controlled Indochina, Algeria, West African territories, and Pacific possessions. Netherlands controlled Indonesia. Belgium controlled Congo. Portugal controlled Angola, Mozambique, and other African territories. Spain maintained remaining colonial possessions. These empires extracted resources, exploited labor, and imposed European political systems and cultural dominance upon colonized peoples. Colonial rule justified itself through racial ideology, claiming European superiority and civilizational mission. World War II devastated European colonial powers economically and militarily. Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan challenged European imperial dominance. Japan conquered much of Asia and Pacific during war. Germany and Italy conquered parts of Africa. World War II required mobilizing colonial resources and populations. Colonial soldiers fought alongside European forces. India provided troops fighting Japanese in Burma. African colonies provided resources supporting British war efforts. Colonial participation in global conflict increased colonial awareness of European vulnerability. Colonial soldiers returning home possessed military training and confidence challenging imperial authority. World War II weakened European capacity to maintain colonial control. Britain emerged victorious but economically devastated, requiring American loans to survive. France suffered humiliating military defeat and Nazi occupation. Netherlands saw Indonesia conquered by Japan. Belgium's Congo was partially occupied. European nations emerged from war materially exhausted and politically destabilized. Reconstruction consumed resources that could have sustained colonial control. Britain could no longer afford maintaining large military forces throughout empire. France proved unable to reconquer Indochina after Japanese occupation. European exhaustion made retaining colonies increasingly difficult and expensive. American and Soviet superpowers opposed European colonialism. American ideology emphasized national self-determination and democracy, incompatible with colonialism. American President Woodrow Wilson had promoted self-determination during World War I. President Franklin Roosevelt opposed British and French imperialism, despite alliance necessity. American Cold War ideology emphasized democracy, opposing authoritarian systems including colonialism. Soviet Union actively supported anti-colonial movements seeking to expand communist influence. Both superpowers preferred independent nations as Cold War battlegrounds rather than European colonial territories. American and Soviet opposition to colonialism undermined European colonial legitimacy. Independence movements emerged throughout colonial world during and after World War II. Colonial intellectuals educated in European universities returned home challenging colonial rule. Colonial nationalist movements articulated independence demands. Some movements had existed decades before independence, others emerged during war. Colonial populations increasingly demanded self-determination and independence. European colonial powers initially refused independence demands, attempting to maintain control through force. However, sustained independence movements, metropolitan exhaustion, and superpower opposition eventually forced decolonization. India achieved independence in 1947, demonstrating decolonization's possibilities and establishing crucial precedent. Indian independence movement developed for decades through nonviolent resistance led by Mohandas Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. Gandhi's nonviolent civil disobedience strategies challenged British authority without military confrontation. Millions participated in boycotts, protests, and non-cooperation campaigns. British eventually recognized independence as less costly than maintaining rule against unified resistance. India achieved independence peacefully without armed warfare, though religious violence erupted during partition, separating India and Pakistan. India's independence inspired colonial independence movements globally. It demonstrated that European powers would ultimately grant independence rather than sustain costly colonial rule indefinitely. Pakistan's creation through Indian partition illustrated decolonization's religious and ethnic complexities. British India contained Hindu and Muslim populations in religiously mixed territories. Independence triggered partition, creating Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan. Partition caused tremendous violence as religious communities attacked each other. Approximately 1–2 million people died during partition violence. 10–15 million people were displaced as communities fled for religious safety. Families were separated. Entire communities were destroyed. Partition demonstrated that independence did not automatically solve underlying ethnic and religious tensions. Post-colonial nationalism sometimes exacerbated religious and ethnic conflicts. Indonesia achieved independence in 1940, 51949, after armed struggle against Dutch recolonization. Indonesian nationalists declared independence in 1945 after Japan's World War II defeat. Netherlands attempted reconquering Indonesia militarily to maintain colonial control. 4 years of warfare devastated Indonesia. International pressure, particularly from United States, eventually forced Dutch recognition of Indonesian independence in 1949. Indonesia's independence demonstrated decolonization's armed struggle necessity when colonial powers refused peaceful transitions. Indonesia's guerrilla warfare against European power showcased colonial populations' capacity for armed resistance. French Indochina experienced catastrophic decolonization warfare. France attempted reconquering Indochina after World War II against Vietnamese nationalist forces led by Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh had allied with allies against Japanese during war, expecting post-war independence. France refused Vietnamese independence demands. Viet Minh forces waged guerrilla warfare against French military. The conflict lasted 9 years with tremendous casualties. France deployed 500. Troops suffering 200,000 casualties. Vietnamese forces suffered greater casualties but maintained resistance. The conflict's brutality shocked France and international community. Viet Minh victory at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 demonstrated French defeat. France agreed to Vietnamese independence. Indochina partition created Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia as independent states. However, Vietnam remained divided temporarily between Communist North and anti-Communist South, setting stage for Vietnam War. Africa's decolonization occurred primarily between 1956 and 1970. Egypt achieved independence in 1952 through military coup ending British control. Gamal Abdel Nasser became Egyptian president embodying Arab nationalism and anti-colonialism. Egypt's independence inspired other African nations. Ghana became first sub-Saharan African colony, achieving independence in 1957. Ghana's independence under Kwame Nkrumah demonstrated African potential for self-governance. Guinea, Mali, Senegal, and other French colonies achieved independence in 1960. Belgium granted Congo independence abruptly in 1960, unprepared for self-government, causing immediate civil war. Nigeria achieved independence in 1960 as Africa's most populous nation. By 1975, virtually all African colonies had achieved independence. Africa's rapid decolonization demonstrated collective determination, rejecting continued colonialism. Portugal maintained colonies longer than other European powers through authoritarian regime, refusing decolonization. Portuguese dictator António de Oliveira Salazar rejected independence demands, considering colonies integral to Portugal. Portugal fought prolonged warfare against independence movements in Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique. These wars lasted from 1961 until 1974, devastating colonial territories. Armed independence movements sustained resistance despite Portuguese military superiority. War exhaustion in Portugal contributed to 1974 military coup overthrowing dictatorship. New Portuguese government immediately granted independence to African colonies. Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau achieved independence in 1970 for 1975. Portuguese decolonization's violent character contrasted with relatively peaceful French and British transitions. Northern Ireland's status remained contested during decolonization era. Irish nationalism sought independence from British rule. Ireland achieved independence in 1922, except Northern Ireland remaining under British control. Northern Ireland contained Catholic and Protestant populations with conflicting loyalties. Cold War divisions coincided with religious divisions, complicating Northern Irish status. Northern Ireland remained British territory throughout decolonization era. However, civil rights movement in Northern Ireland during 1960s challenged discrimination against Catholic minority. Northern Irish conflict intensified during 1970s and beyond with armed conflict between nationalist and unionist communities. Palestine's decolonization created Middle Eastern conflict persisting to present. Palestine had been British Mandate territory since World War I. Jewish immigration increased during 20th century, supported by Zionist movement and British sympathy. Palestinian Arab population opposed Jewish immigration fearing displacement. Britain's incompatible promises to Jewish and Arab communities created conflict. In 1948, British withdrew and Jewish leaders declared Israeli state. Arab armies invaded attempting to prevent Israeli state creation. First Arab-Israeli War resulted in Israeli military victory. Approximately 700,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled. Palestine's decolonization created Israeli-Palestinian conflict that persists to present day, involving decades of warfare, occupation, and humanitarian crisis. Algeria's decolonization involved brutal warfare devastating both French and Algerian populations. France possessed substantial settler population in Algeria, considering it French territory. Algerian independence movement began in 1954 with armed rebellion. France responded with military brutality, attempting counterinsurgency. Algerian independence forces conducted guerrilla warfare and terrorism. 8-year war killed approximately 1 million Algerians and 25,000 French troops. French society became polarized over Algeria with significant opposition to continuing war. In 1962, France acknowledged Algerian independence. Approximately 1 million French settlers fled Algeria, creating refugee crisis in France. Algeria's independence was achieved through prolonged violent struggle, unlike peaceful British and French transitions elsewhere. Suez Crisis of 1956 demonstrated declining European power and decolonization's geopolitical consequences. Egyptian President Nasser nationalized Suez Canal, previously controlled by British and French. Britain and France invaded Egypt to recapture canal with Israeli assistance. However, United States and Soviet Union opposed invasion, threatening economic and military consequences. Faced with superpower opposition, Britain and France withdrew military forces. Suez Crisis demonstrated that European powers could no longer enforce imperial will against superpower opposition. It marked psychological turning point in decolonization, establishing that armed European intervention could no longer sustain colonial control. Kenya's decolonization involved Mau Mau insurgency against British rule and white settler dominance. Kikuyu people, Kenya's largest ethnic group, led independence movement. Mau Mau movement conducted armed rebellion against British authority and white settlers. Britain responded with military force and detention camps, where thousands died from torture and mistreatment. Mau Mau rebellion lasted approximately 4 years with thousands of casualties on both sides. Eventually, Britain negotiated Kenyan independence in 1964 under Jomo Kenyatta's leadership. Kenya's decolonization demonstrated settler colonialism's vulnerability and white settler minorities' eventual inability to sustain rule against African majority populations. Caribbean decolonization occurred throughout 1960s and 1970s as Caribbean colonies achieved independence. Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, and other colonies gained independence from Britain. Caribbean nations faced economic challenges as small island economies with limited resources. Many Caribbean nations required external economic support. However, Caribbean independence represented Caribbean people's self-determination, rejecting continued colonialism. Caribbean nations joined non-aligned movement, attempting independence from Cold War superpower dominance. The non-aligned movement emerged during decolonization, emphasizing colonized nations' independence from Cold War divisions. Newly independent nations sought to avoid alignment with either American or Soviet blocs. Non-aligned nations emphasized national sovereignty and self-determination. The movement included India, Egypt, Yugoslavia, Indonesia, and numerous African nations. Non-aligned nations attempted collective action through United Nations and international conferences. However, Cold War pressures ultimately limited non-alignment possibilities as superpowers pressured nations into alignment. Cold War dimensions complicated decolonization processes. United States and Soviet Union competed for influence throughout decolonized world. Both superpowers supported some independence movements opposing colonialism. However, superpowers also competed for influence over newly independent nations. Communist independence movements received Soviet support. Anti-communist independence movements received American support. Some decolonization conflicts became Cold War battlegrounds. Angola's independence struggle involved American and South African support for one faction against Soviet and Cuban support for another. Congo's independence triggered superpower intervention. Cold War competition subordinated decolonization movements to superpower strategic interests. Decolonization's pace accelerated during 1960, celebrated as Year of Africa, with numerous African nations achieving independence. France granted independence to numerous African colonies simultaneously. Belgium, Britain, and other powers accelerated independence timelines. By mid-1960s, decolonization appeared inevitable and unstoppable. Colonial powers recognized that maintaining colonies against determined populations cost more resources than granting independence. However, decolonization also demonstrated that independence did not automatically ensure prosperity or stability. Post-colonial instability plagued numerous newly independent nations. Power vacuums created by departing colonial authorities sometimes resulted in civil wars. Ethnic and religious tensions emerged without colonial authority suppressing them. Military coups overthrew civilian governments in numerous newly independent nations. Economic exploitation by colonial powers had prevented capital accumulation and infrastructure development. Many new nations inherited economies structured for colonial extraction rather than domestic development. Tribalism, ethnic conflict, and religious tensions plagued numerous post-colonial societies. Some newly independent nations experienced decades of instability and warfare. Neocolonialism emerged as colonialism's successor system. While political independence was achieved, economic domination often continued. Multinational corporations controlled resources and profits. Former colonial powers maintained economic influence through economic ties, debt arrangements, and trade relationships. International financial institutions imposed conditions limiting newly independent nations' policy autonomy. Resource extraction continued enriching foreign corporations rather than local populations. Neocolonialism represented colonialism's transformation into economic rather than political form. Decolonization's impact on international institutions was profound. United Nations membership expanded from 51 nations in 1945 to 182 by 2000 as colonies achieved independence. United Nations General Assembly increasingly reflected developing world interests as newly independent nations became voting majority. Decolonization process accelerated when United Nations resolutions condemned colonialism. United Nations Trusteeship Council administered territories on path to independence. Decolonization transformed United Nations from institution dominated by colonial powers to forum emphasizing developing world concerns. International law evolved regarding decolonization through United Nations resolutions. General Assembly Resolution 1514 in 1960 recognized people's right to self-determination and demanded colonialism's end. United Nations established Special Committee on Decolonization, monitoring independence processes. International law increasingly recognized self-determination as fundamental principle. However, self-determination remained contested regarding minorities within newly independent nations seeking secession. International law's emphasis on territorial integrity over self-determination prevented numerous separatist movements from achieving independence. Post-colonial tribalism and ethnic conflict challenged nation-building. Colonial boundaries often divided ethnic groups or combined hostile groups into single territories. Colonial rule suppressed ethnic nationalism through authoritarian control. Independence removed colonial suppression, allowing ethnic tensions to emerge. Rwanda, Burundi, Nigeria, and other nations experienced ethnic violence during post-colonial period. Sudan divided between Arab North and African South, reflecting ethnic and religious divisions. Numerous post-colonial conflicts reflected underlying ethnic tensions rather than ideological differences. Gender and women's movements occurred during and after decolonization. Women participated significantly in independence movements. However, post-colonial governments often marginalized women despite women's independence struggle participation. Male nationalist leaders frequently assumed traditional patriarchal roles, excluding women from post-colonial leadership. Some nations enshrined patriarchal law in post-colonial legal systems. Women's movements emerged, subsequently challenging post-colonial gender discrimination. However, progress in women's rights varied significantly across post-colonial nations. Decolonization's cultural impacts included language and education debates. Post-colonial nations debated whether to maintain colonial languages or adopt indigenous languages. Many nations retained colonial languages as official languages due to linguistic diversity and practical communication considerations. Education systems required reconstruction after colonialism. Post-colonial nations expanded education access previously restricted by colonial authorities. However, education sometimes perpetuated colonial curricula and values rather than decolonizing intellectual frameworks. Economic development challenges plagued post-colonial nations. Colonial exploitation had prevented capital accumulation and infrastructure development. Newly independent nations inherited colonial economic structures extracting resources rather than developing domestic industries. Capital requirements for industrialization exceeded available resources. Debt burdens limited economic policy autonomy. International financial institutions imposed structural adjustment conditions, limiting government spending. Economic development remained elusive for many post-colonial nations despite political independence. Pan-Africanism emerged as decolonization ideology, emphasizing African unity and cooperation. Pan-Africanism rejected colonial divisions, emphasizing African continental identity. African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, and others advocated continental unity. Organization of African Unity, established 1963, represented institutional embodiment of Pan-Africanism. However, post-colonial national interests frequently overrode Pan-African solidarity. National borders inherited from colonialism constrained continental unity. Economic competition and political rivalries prevented meaningful African unity. Pan-Africanism remained ideal rather than achieved reality. Vietnam War represented decolonization era's most destructive conflict. French Indochina's partition left Vietnam divided. Cold War dynamics transformed Vietnamese nationalism into communist-capitalist confrontation. American military intervention from 1965–1973 devastated Vietnam, killing 3 million people. Vietnamese victory demonstrated that determined nations could resist superpower intervention despite military superiority. Vietnam War represented both decolonization victory and Cold War tragedy. It demonstrated nationalism's power while showing Cold War competition's destructive potential. Decolonization affected international migration and demographic changes. Colonial populations of European settlers remained in numerous territories after independence. European minorities sometimes faced discrimination or violence. White settler minorities in southern Africa resisted African majority rule. Rhodesia and South Africa attempted maintaining white rule against decolonization principles. However, international pressure eventually forced white minority rule acceptance. Migration from former colonies to former colonial powers accelerated. British, French, and other European nations received immigrants from colonies. Migration transformed European societies, creating multicultural populations. South African apartheid represented decolonization's most extreme resistance and eventual collapse. South Africa achieved independence, but white minority maintained political power through apartheid system. Apartheid legally enforced racial segregation and discrimination. Nelson Mandela and African National Congress led independence struggle lasting decades. International sanctions pressured South African government. Internal resistance created unsustainable pressure. Apartheid collapsed in 1994 when white minority government agreed to majority rule. Mandela's election as president represented decolonization's victory over entrenched white racism. However, post-apartheid inequality and racial tension persisted despite formal equality. Decolonization's religious dimensions varied across regions. Hindu-majority India maintained secular constitution despite religious tensions. Muslim-majority nations confronted Islam's political role. Christian minorities in some post-colonial nations faced discrimination. Religious institutions sometimes supported independence movements. However, post-colonial governments often promoted secular nationalism, attempting to transcend religious divisions. However, religious nationalism emerged subsequently in numerous post-colonial nations, as Hindutva in India and Islamism throughout Muslim-majority nations. Decolonization transformed global power structures fundamentally. European dominance that lasted 450 years collapsed within generation. United States and Soviet Union emerged as superpowers competing for influence among newly independent nations. Non-Western nations gained voice in international affairs previously excluded. Global inequality patterns shifted as some post-colonial nations achieved economic development while others stagnated. Decolonization ended explicit colonialism, but economic inequality and neocolonial dominance persisted. Newly independent nations possessed political sovereignty but limited economic autonomy. Decolonization's legacy persists in contemporary international relations. Numerous post-colonial nations remain economically disadvantaged due to colonial exploitation and subsequent development challenges. Territorial disputes inherited from colonial boundaries continue creating conflicts. Ethnic nationalism originating in post-colonial tribalism generates contemporary conflicts. Language and cultural divisions reflecting colonial legacies persist. International inequality patterns reflect colonial extraction and post-colonial subordination. Decolonization represented major historical transformation creating modern nation-state system, yet leaving fundamental inequalities and conflicts unresolved. Understanding decolonization remains essential for comprehending contemporary global affairs, development challenges, ethnic conflicts, and international relations fundamentally shaped by decolonization's incomplete resolution of colonialism's legacy.